everyone! Today I'm going to be going over how we do the slip stitch color work in knitting. This slip stitch colorway in knitting is one of those techniques that looks really complicated. So when I do a close-up of the piece, you get a lot of color, you get a lot of interest, you get a lot of things going on with it. But when you're actually doing it and creating it, it's not a complicated thing to do. It's not really a whole lot harder than just knitting stripes. You are only ever working with one colored yarn at a time, and you're just doing one extra little thing as you're going. So let's jump into the technique of actually how to make this happen, and then we can talk a little bit about some tips and tricks and some things if you plan to add this into a pattern or you're writing a pattern, what you may want to keep in mind as you're working on this. So for slip stitch colorway, you are going to want to have two different colors of yarn, and I would recommend two pretty strikingly different colors, especially as you're just getting started. It is going to be a lot easier to see where you are in your piece and what you're doing if you've got two strikingly different colors. But the only thing that you actually need to do with this is you are going to get started, create some fabric with just one of your colors, and then when you are ready to add your next color, exactly as if you were doing stripes, when you're adding your new color, you're just going to take the end of the new color yarn that you want to add. You are going to just leave about 6 inches of that hanging off the edge of your piece, and you're just going to start knitting with that new color yarn. And so you're going to knit, your pattern is going to tell you how many stitches to knit. In the Wandering Airplane socks, in the slip stitch color work that I'm doing for those, I believe I did five stitches with one color and then slip a stitch. So that's what I'll do on here. Generally, you're going to do these with an odd number of stitches when you're slipping stitches. So you're just going to knit whatever number of stitches your pattern is telling you to do. So I'm going to knit 5. So knit 5 stitches totally normally with your second color of yarn. And then all we are going to do is we are going to slip 1 stitch. So I'm not knitting or purling, I'm just taking my needle, putting it into the stitch. You do want to put it into the stitch as if you are going to purl. Put it into the stitch there and then just slide it across to the other needle. So we didn't knit or purl that stitch, we just slid it across. And now you're going to knit whatever number the pattern is telling you to do again with the new color yarn. And so that gives us, when we get to the end of the row, what you're going to end up with is you are going to end up with 5 stitches of the color that you made that row with, and then you're going to end up with 1 stitch that's the color from the last row that you did. Because we didn't knit that stitch, we just slipped it. And so this blue stitch right in the middle of my teal, my 2 teal parts, this stitch is actually the stitch from the previous row, and so it is still the color of the previous row. That is all there is to slip stitch knitting. What you're actually doing is you are dragging a color from the previous row. You're dragging that color up so you can see you'll have a section that is one color from the row below, and then you're pulling that up into the next section. And that is how you get that it looks like you've done, like you've knit with white and then teal and then white and then teal and then white and then teal. You haven't. The teal is what you finished with, and then in the white section, you're just slipping that stitch that was teal. You're just slipping that up and carrying it up and up. Because you're just taking that stitch and dragging it up, there's a limit to how high up you can get that, to how many rows you can do that. So I got to the end of this first row. I am just gonna swap it, turn around because I'm gonna go back the other way. When I'm working back this way, I'm working with my new yarn, like my second color that I started, that teal one instead of that dark blue. I'm purling all of the teal colored stitches. So I've got the 5 teal stitches on my needle. I'm purling those until I get to that blue stitch in the middle that I slipped on the previous row. It's really, really easy to tell where you are in a slip stitch colorway project because it's that different color. So when you get to that one stitch, that's not the color of everything else on your needle, that is your cue. You're just gonna slip that stitch. You're not knitting it or purling it, you are just putting your needle in as if to purl and slipping it across. And now you're going to purl across the next 5 stitches in your new color as well. So you've got that exact same thing that we had in the last row. You've got your teal stitches on one half, you've got that one blue stitch in the middle that we slipped, and it's from all the way down 2 rows ago now, this dark blue at the bottom, and then we've got our teal stitches on the other side. So this blue stitch in the middle, now that's dragged up for 2 rows, and if you look super close at it, the lighting in here is not letting me show. I thought these were very different colors, and it turns out they're a little bit closer together than I would have ideally wanted them to be. Let that be a lesson. Doing it with strikingly different colors, like a black and a white, may make it easier for your first project to do. But you're dragging that dark blue stitch up through 2 rows now of the teal color. You can do this, generally most patterns are not going to have you do this for more than 4 rows. Once you've pulled it up 4 times as high as it was supposed to be, as long as sort of as much yarn as was there and allotted for that stitch. Once you've done that, up 4 rows, it's kind of pulled as tight as it can get and still create fabric that lays kind of flat. You probably don't want fabric that's going to really start puckering where that stitch like pulls your fabric down right there. You probably are trying to create fabric that pretty much lays flat. And so generally you're not going to be doing this for more than about 4 rows, although it does depend on how thick is your yarn, what gauge are you doing, that kind of thing. But once you have finished that, once you finish, let's say your pattern is having you do just 2 rows. So that's what I've done right now, just 2 rows with my new color. If now I switch to the original color that I used, so the blue in this example, if I now switch to the blue, I can drag that teal color that I've just been working with, I can drag that up through the next stripe of blue. So the only stitch that is not available to do that with is the blue stitch from the previous row, because I'm now going to start working with my blue yarn. If I continue to slip that blue stitch, it's not going to be a different color because that stitch is already blue. So generally what slip stitch patterns have you do is they generally have you sort of center that stitch. So what I am going to do is I'm going to knit with my blue yarn. I'm going to knit until I get to 3 stitches before that middle stitch, that middle blue stitch. I'll hold it here, sort of as if you were doing the knitting. I've got my blue stitch in the middle that was slipped from the original blue stripe. And I've got 3 teal stitches that came before that blue stitch. I'm going to slip that 3rd teal stitch onto my needle. And now I'm going to just regularly knit across the next 5 stitches. And what that's going to do is, I'll flip it around because I'm switching between knitting right-handed and knitting left-handed and it's making my brain hurt. So I'm going to knit across including that stitch that is blue from the previous blue stripe that I've been pulling up every time. I'm gonna knit through that stitch as well. And because it was blue and now I'm working with blue again, it's gonna look like that just transitions straight in to the blue, into the next blue stripe. So I knit that one, and then I knit 2 more of the teal stitches from the previous row. And now I'm going to slip another of my teal stitches and then knit to the end of the row with the blue. So what I've got happening now is in the very center, I've got the blue from the first stripe is pulled through the teal section. And now with that centered in the middle, now I've got these 2 teal stitches that are going to be pulled up through this now blue section that I'm working. And that is exactly what happens in these socks. You have got the color from the row below is pulled up through the next row that you're working. With these particular socks, I actually added another layer to it because I can't leave well enough alone, and I really love stripes that stripe. I don't know why. I do a lot with stripes that stripe. I actually used a self-striping yarn, and I worked from both ends. So I've got the stripe here goes from blue to pink to white, and then the stripe going the other way goes from white to pink to blue. And so that is why it looks like there's loads of colors here. There are, but I actually made these socks with just 1 ball of yarn. That ball of yarn just happened to be a self-striping ball of yarn. Dyed by Ba Yarns, Brenda and Heather. It was our Roving Indiana limited edition yarn from last year, and I made this pattern for these socks. If you love the look of these, which I do, these are the Wandering Airplane socks, and they're by me, Erica Kim Broughton, on Ravelry. They're for sale for the pattern. Unfortunately, that yarn was custom just for Roving Indiana last year. However, we actually, up on our website, we do have like 3 balls of it left. So if you love it, we've got it. Also, Ba Yarns has just dyed an awesome custom colorway based on the truck art design from our yarn truck called Yarn Truck at the End of the Rainbow that would also make very good version of these socks, although they would look very different because of how the stripes work. But this can give you an idea of something else you can do with the self-striping yarn that adds another little bit of interest other than just stripes. So that is my basic how-to on the slip stitch colorway. I did want to give a couple of little tips and tricks though, in case you want to either investigate a pattern. There's a lot of great patterns that use this technique, the slipped stitch color work. In my opinion, it's a little bit of a misnomer with the color work. I just think that makes it sound like you're working with multiple colors at the same time, and you're just not. It's you honestly and truly, they're worked identically to if you were doing stripes, except for every 5th stitch or something, you're just slipping 1 stitch. And in a lot of ways, slipping a stitch is easier than knitting or purling the stitch because you're not doing any of those things. You're just slipping it. So I personally love that kind of technique because it looks like you've done something really intricate, but it didn't actually take that much longer or wasn't that much more complicated to do, which is my favorite kind of project, things that look impressive but weren't really that hard. So I would definitely recommend, have a look if you like the look of that, and jump in and try a little bit, or just make yourself a little square to prove to yourself that you know how to do it. I will give you one word of advice. If you have a pattern that you love, you've made a million pairs of socks, you have the pattern that works perfectly for you, you don't want to mess with your pattern, you just want to try the slip stitch on it, you want to kind of add this into an existing pattern, be aware it creates a fabric that is a little bit less stretchy. That's probably the biggest thing to keep in your brain if you're doing this project. It's not that it makes it less stretchy side to side necessarily, because you're not doing anything to the width of the stitches, but it definitely makes it less stretchy up and down, And because you're forcing one stitch to stretch up 4 times or 2 times or 5 times, whatever your pattern is calling for, you're forcing that that stitch to go way higher than it normally would. So you're taking away some of the flexibility that that stitch has. And because they're spaced all over the project, that's going to make it much less stretchy up and down. And because of the way knitted fabric works, if you're taking stretch away from one way, when you go to put this on your foot, it's not, because it can't stretch as much evenly in all directions. It's going to need to stretch more side to side to kind of make up for that stretching top to bottom. So it's going to make these socks fit more snugly. Somebody says they're loving the color scheme. I love it too. Bright colors are my thing. So you can't get a lot brighter than like chartreuse and hot pink on this one. So just be aware, if you're doing it with something that relies on stretch, just be a little bit more conscious of, you may need to add a couple of stitches to make it fit the way they fit if you were not doing the slip stitch colorway. That's basically going to apply to socks and hats, because both of those are generally going to be a little bit smaller than the foot or the head you're trying to put them on. So you just need to give yourself a little bit of extra stretch to it. The other trick that I would recommend, I said it before, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's that important. If you're going to do the work and the counting to make this happen and turn out, use 2 strikingly different colors. If you do like a medium blue and a dark blue, you're just not going to see it. It's not going to jump out at you. You're going to lose some of the punch behind the technique. I will also say there are some patterns that I sort of mentioned you can only pull. My kind of rule for myself is I can only slip that stitch 4 times. I can only do 4 rows to pull it up, and then I have to knit that stitch again. That's only how high it will go. But that is to create a fabric that mostly lays flat. There are certainly patterns out there that have you slip more than 4 rows, and they are intentionally creating a really textured fabric. So what's going to happen if you're slipping 6 rows or 8 rows? The slipped stitches are almost going to like pinch down the edges where they are slipped. They can only stretch so far. They hit their limit at 4 rows that are around about. And then if you do additional rows in there, they can't stretch anymore. They've used all their stretch that they've got. And you're actually going to start getting the fabric that you're creating between those stitches is using more space than those stitches will stretch to let it be up and down fabric. And so that fabric is going to sort of bubble out side to side. You've created extra fabric, there's no room for it, it's got to go somewhere. And so it kind of bubbles in, and you end up with, it almost looks like a honeycomb. And that's a lot of times what people are using it for. They're using it to create that honeycomb kind of effect. So you've got your slip stitches are like pulled tight and pop out, and then the extra fabric that you created that didn't have any place to go sort of bubbles into the back. And so you've got these, one color pops out at you as this sort of framework around, and then it's almost like recessed windows into that frame, or like a honeycomb that's back into it. So if you do like a black and white color scheme, it will be almost like you've got black trim around your windows and then they're white inside as they recess back. So that can have a really neat effect. But you've got to be aware that it's going to do that your fabric is going to change textures. And if you're doing that with it, you're really going to have to play with how the stitches and how your piece is going to fit and what size it's going to be, because then you're really changing how much the fabric stretches and even how big it is, because it can't. You're doing rows that won't let it grow taller. They're just creating that texture to it. So that is kind of my spiel on slip stitch colorway. It's fun to try. Give it a go. It can be a great use, I think, especially with self-striping yarn. You can do a self-striping yarn and a solid, so you're going to have one layer will change colors as you go and one layer will always be the same color. I think that can be really fun as well. If you have a lot of self-striping and you'd like to just jazz it up just a little bit, if you feel like you have enough things that are just stripes, you can put some of the slip stitch colorway as well. And it certainly works great with 2 solid color yarns also. That is probably the most common way of doing it, is with 2 different colors. So I hope this was helpful and you enjoyed it, and I hope the next time you see a pattern for a slip stitch color work piece, you jump right in because you know it's not hard.